Hey there, Hetty here. There are, in my opinion, a fair few topics that don't translate terribly well to the YouTube audio post format. The necessary conciseness gets in the way of tackling the detailed evolution of ideas, their nuance, and the means by which they overlap with or tap into other concepts. Brevity may be the soul of wit, but it's the enemy of complexity. Sometimes there's nothing for it then but to break a topic down into a series of loosely related chapters and hope the lot comes together into a recognizable whole at the end. I mention this because the topics I want to discuss over the course of the next few videos relate to an approach or technique whose value to me can't be summed up with a simple overview of the whole. Each of its component layers has to be pulled back and examined in turn to do it justice. And if there is to be any hope of clarifying how its various facets interact to produce something paradigm-shifting. There's no obvious starting place, unfortunately. The power of onion analogies notwithstanding, they suggest a level of hierarchical organization that just doesn't apply here. So, for the purposes of launching this discussion, I'm going to start in the same place my own experimentation did. The idea of rare ingredients for spells. I've always favored the idea of using rare and hard-to-come-by ingredients, at least in theory. Using them in practice is a real pain in the ass, though, and presents no shortage of logistical and ethical challenges. Challenges that I've found hard to justify in light of my opinions on the value of these ingredients. For the most part, my feeling is that unless you're making something you plan on ingesting or applying to your person, the specific ingredients aren't there to confer physical properties to your spell, but symbolic ones. Some people would, of course, disagree. Some think that the physical properties of items are themselves the source of those objects' power. Well, fair enough, but it's not a view I share. And while it doesn't matter that we agree, I think it does matter that we each develop a clear sense of where we ourselves fall on this axis of opinion, because our differing perspectives fundamentally dictate what paths are open to us when it comes to the identification, collection, and use of ingredients. And here's why. The range of appropriate substitutes for an ingredient is defined by and limited by the specific set of features that confer power to that ingredient, in your opinion. Put another way, if only a subset of an item's parts are responsible for the effects you desire, then you don't really need the whole. You just need that subset of features, which may be found in a broader category of things. To use a mundane example, if a celebration calls for champagne to delight your friend following an accomplishment, what is that celebration really calling for? Do you need a $70 bottle of Veuve Clicquot along with an intact label, the price tag, and its contents? Will a $15 bottle of sparkling California White do just as well? Will the $15 sparkling wine do better if you call it champagne? What about if the contents of that $15 bottle are swapped into a $70 package? Does that make the result more or less potent? And what about the sound of the cork popping? Does that matter? Does the chill on the glass matter? Does the surprise presentation of a famously luxe beverage confer more power to the moment than does an anticipated delivery? Hopefully, the example both highlights the range of possible considerations and helps illustrate that we're not just dealing with individual features that are all members of a single larger group, but that we're dealing with different classes of features. For instance, I described various sensory features like flavor, appearance, physical feel, and contextual features, the momentous presentation, the surprise or lack thereof. Those of you who've watched several of my videos are probably relatively unsurprised yourself that I've once again brought up sensation and context. Now, here are some additional questions that will surely sound even more familiar because they often come up in conversations about spellcrafting ingredients. Does the challenge of procuring the item matter? Does the psychological and spiritual intent of an item's procurement render it more potent? Do we drop coin on the expensive bottle of booze because our friend can really tell the difference between the good stuff and the nasty? Or because our sacrifice, even if unspoken, infuses it with a small measure of our devotion? Is the potency of that devotion amplified by the rarity of the vintage, by the newness of the flavor or experience, by the thoughtful inclusion of complementary items designed to enhance the intensity of the focal one? Here we've gotten into the class of intentional features, the features conferred by the intent of the item's wielder, as well as interpretive features, the power infused into the item by the individuals reacting to the perceived significance of the item's acquisition or presentation. It's in considering these sorts of questions and feature classes that I sought and seek to identify the value and impact of a spellcasting ingredient, and the range of alternatives at my disposal. And in considering them, I've come to the conclusion that, often, the best ingredients needn't rely upon physical existence at all. I maintain a garden of rare species of plants and other collectibles that I've come to regard as particularly potent. In many cases, these things are entirely unique and live nowhere else. Because I'm a member of the Illuminati. Also a Bond villain. No, actually, it's because the garden I'm talking about is one that exists outside the physical realm. It's added to, tended, and pruned as carefully as any backyard vegetable plot, though. Curated like a museum, but with less skill than people who actually do that for a living. I've sunk who knows how many hours into it. Its contents are sometimes created consciously and from scratch. Other times they're found during my pathworkings and meditative travels, and carried back to the garden where they're planted or placed. I make the rounds of this garden regularly, to look, to touch, and smell what's growing there, to water and feed each species whatever nutrients they require. Some thrive on devotionals, others on feelings of anger or pain, and they let me know what they want from me more or less the same way my physical plants and belongings do, by thriving or not. Some species multiply or transform unexpectedly, letting me know that they've tapped into some well I didn't realize was lurking out of sight. Others never reproduce at all and are forever limited to 2 or 3 blooms whose use I worry about squandering. Occasionally, whole patches of a thing disappear, the price perhaps of acting too slowly, and so failing to use them toward whatever purpose they sprang into existence for. This garden isn't vague or fleeting. The potency of the items housed within have made it solid and given it permanence even as corners of it change to reveal the results of the energies at work there. This garden serves several roles at once, and for me, thus far, the most important 3 are these: its function as a bellwether and mirror of my own state and mind, its function as an energy sink and transformation space, and its function as a spellcrafting pantry. These discrete functions emerged over time as I created/discovered, familiarized myself with, and worked within the space, and I'll come around to discussing my experience with each of them. For now, though, let's get into the topic of the garden as a mental spellcrafting pantry. Although I think it behooves us to take time to assess each ingredient and tool in order to sort out what we think gives it power, there are some common qualities that many before me have suggested contribute to the potency of most rare and difficult to come by ingredients, and I tend to agree with them. One is the idea of investment, which we discussed in our example a couple of minutes ago and upon which I'll focus today. I think the concept of investment can be broken down into 3 subtypes: time investment, investment of effort, and sacrifice. These types are not mutually exclusive. A thing can fall into any or all subcategories. And importantly for our purposes here, making these investments in the mental realm is equivalent to making them in the material world. Mental effort is effort regardless of whether it's being invested into analyzing a textbook figure depicting the cell death pathway or the branching patterns of a tree in your mental garden. A week is a week, whether you're waiting for your material or psychic rose bush to bloom. You can pour physical sweat into your mental garden just as easily as you can into a material one, although the techniques involved in doing so, of course, differ. But I'll save the details on this part for another video. You can likewise sacrifice a psychic item of great value the same way you'd sacrifice a physical one, because in nearly all cases, the thing you're giving up derives its value from intangible aspects rather than its physical ones. That is, in either case, you're acting in opposition to your covetousness, your desire to have or use a thing in one form, so that it can instead be released to the intentions and desires of another or itself. Almost every other metric of investment, whether it's money, forfeiting autonomy, or embracing physical hardship, are simply manifestations of one of these three core subtypes of investment. This fact, that investment is investment regardless of whether it's poured into the physical realm or the mental one, is crucial because it's what allows the items in one's mental garden to be imbued with all the potency of intentional effort that sent others to journey into the deep woods for rare orchids or to the mouths of caves to sacrifice goats. It means that for any physical item that calls for extraordinary acts to acquire it, a cognate to such trials can be developed or discovered in the witch's mind, or in whatever other non-physical plane you work with. The same rule holds true for other features of an item's efficacy and identity, by the way, and I encourage anybody who's interested to have a go at considering how each of these other feature classes can be translated to the mental realm. So, from a methodological standpoint, how do I actually go about identifying the mentally constructed ingredient I need? And how do I then go about attaining it while ensuring that it's more than just a pretty mind picture of the real deal? In my experience, the answers depend on two things. One is whether I'm looking to replace a physical item whose identity I know, but for whatever reason cannot or will not use, versus an item whose function is clear, but whose nature isn't. The second is the extent to which the features my item require can be consciously conferred by myself or necessitate the involvement of a third party, whether we conceptualize that third party to be our unconscious, our gods, or some other entity. Let's use an extreme example inspired by some of the spells in the Greek magical papyri, which is an interesting text, chock full of seriously problematic spells, reflective of ideologies that would be considered nothing short of psychopathic in this era. I should absolutely make a video on the topic one day, because holy hells, what a shit show, but I digress. At least one of the PGM spells calls for a bone from a deceased person who died violently. Now, no explanation is provided for why such an item might be required, and the spell I'm thinking of isn't one I'd want to work anyway, but even so, I can imagine the potential utility of just this sort of thing for spells or rituals that I would be interested in completing. And I'm sure you can too. One possibility is ancestral work. The bone of one of your ancestors could certainly serve as a powerful point of contact between you and them. Similarly, a bone belonging to somebody who lived during a particular era may act as a sort of temporal and cultural bridge to that point in history and to that civilization. Laying your hands on such a bone is often all but impossible, though, and even when it isn't, the barrier to entry for getting into grave robbery is substantial and calls for setting aside thousands of dollars to pay for your future defense attorney. In this case, my task is therefore to figure out what features an appropriate replacement item would have in order to confer the same power to my work. We'd want something that ties us to the source we seek to tap into, whether it's a specific person or a specific set of experiences. We'd also want comparable interpretive features. Since we've already talked about effort, let's stick with this. The author of the PGM spell that inspired our example would almost certainly actually resort to grave robbery itself, The tracking down of an appropriate deceased person and the stealing away in the dead of night to dig up their grave are both major components of this effort then. These two acts can be conceptualized as acts of seeking, literally searching for an appropriate item, and of risk tolerance, willfully facing danger or violating taboos. One thing worth noting here is that, for my purposes, I would want to exclude one notable feature of the PGM author's item, the feature of disrespect that, to my mind, is inherent in stealing a part of a person without consent. Instead, then, I would want to add an additional aspect of effort, the act of requesting access to the spell component. In other words, I'd want my item to require sacrifice in the form of my willing surrender of conscious autonomy in its acquisition, so that the question of whether I actually get what I'm looking for is not ultimately determined by me, but by the willingness of something else to part with it. Taking all of this into account, I'd therefore assume that my best course of action was not to mentally construct a cognate from scratch, but to venture into the astral or mental realms in search of it. Perhaps the endeavor would call for a path working, one jump-started by an intermediary item, like an old photograph, perhaps. Or maybe I'd do best to begin by meditating while seated on a cemetery bench, to seek insight from the locale and locals. In all cases, I'd go in knowing that a single hour of searching wouldn't be sufficient. Trying to hasten the process inherently undermines the requirement of effort, and so would weaken the power of what I came home with. Perhaps in asking for guidance, I would do best to evoke a guide whose nature unsettles me, a nod to the fear of transgression inherent in violating the social norms that protect burial places from interference by the living. Maybe a guardian of the dead archetype with no loyalty to those still alive. And perhaps upon asking for this guardian's help, I'd offer payment in whatever form they requested, and ask them what they wish of me. Perhaps the place or entity that ultimately revealed my bone item would demand that I open myself up to some of what was experienced by they who possessed it. Here is the surrender, the sacrifice of autonomy and control over one's own well-being in this case. If you're getting the impression that the process can be genuinely unsettling and risky, you're not wrong. Again, though, this is a reflection of the example we're using, which is itself dark and heavy with the weight of significance and the responsibility of pure intent. Pathworking the sun card and bringing home a cutting from one of the sunflowers is not, I think, going to run the same sorts of risks and evoke the same level of discomfort for most people. And I would tend to suggest that in shaping one's garden and beginning this work, it's best to start with items and environments in which you'll feel safe, although not necessarily unambitious or familiar. I want to make clear, though, that the potential in terms of potency of these items is broad and intense, and you just can't drive that message home the same way when you're evoking images of dancing butterflies and fat, frolicking babies. There'll be other examples of ingredients and the various means one can go about finding or constructing them in future videos, because fundamentally the items themselves are a good chunk of what confers identity and feel to your garden. And, as stated in the intro, the nature of the garden is derived from the influence of many layers. In the next video, I'll talk about the creation and maintenance of the garden space itself, and its function as a bellwether and mirror of our own self and the things within it. For those of you thinking, the hell, woman, why didn't you just start there so I can try the damn thing myself? The reason is that I didn't start by making the garden space. It began to emerge from the things I brought back with me to a non-defined part of my mental workspace during the course of seeking out rare ingredients. And I've come to think that this fact is somehow important, or maybe even key to the way it evolved for me. So I do encourage you to try putting some of what I discussed today into action if you'd like to. As for the future site of your garden, I suggest that you let it begin as a featureless void in the mental realm. Wait and see whether pockets of it begin to take shape on their own around the items you create or carry into it. Study these materialized pockets, but for now, resist the urge to modify them or supplant them with conscious creation. Until next time then, happy travels.